Hello and welcome to another edition of the AI learning journey. Today what we're going to talk about is detecting deepfakes and how YouTube now allows you to request the removal of AI generated content that may be depicting you. So let's go ahead, let's dive right into this. So here's a little bit of background. So there was a story that was out. This is a TechCrunch's article, but this was covered by multiple media outlets. And the bottom line is that users can now go ahead and request content to be removed if that content is synthetic, fake, or AI generated and imitates or mimics the requester's face or voice. Now, this is one of those things where you can request it to be removed, and then you can see here there's a whole bunch of requirements that this request would be subject to. So naturally, they would go through a review process, and there's definitely some time that could elapse between the time that you actually report this and the time that it's actually resolved. So that becomes a little bit interesting from that perspective. But I think it's a step in the right direction, trying to get ahead of this before it becomes too big of an issue. And I think this is bound to become a big issue. We've already started to see some videos that take place where someone is being imitated or misrepresented, or it's flat out fraud in some cases. And will YouTube be able to respond in a timely manner? I think that's ultimately the question here. And I think sometimes, especially today, you can go ahead and detect some of these deepfakes. Like I saw one, fairly recently with Dave Chappelle, the comedian. And you could tell that wasn't him, but still this line will get blurry and blurrier as time goes on, because this is only going to become more prevalent. Unfortunately, I think this is one of those downsides of AI. Now, this is kind of interesting in some respects, where last week we did talk about how the role of public data sources are being used for training. And the last thing we want to have is people's information or likeness being impersonated, because that just can be very misleading for the consumer of that content. And if you think about endorsements or even influencer marketing, this is just headed in a very sort of bad direction. Now, another story that I ran into this week, which I find quite interesting and actually almost takes the opposite take of what we were just talking about, is that celebrities such as James Dean, Judy Garland, and Burt Reynolds can now be used. Their likeness can now be used to go ahead and their voice being used so that PDFs, ebooks, and other texts can be read off to you in their voice. Now, what's common across these three people is they are deceased, they are dead. So naturally, this isn't a situation where someone is impersonating, say, the president or some other prominent figure, and there's flat out fraud. The other thing that is, very much worth noting here is that this content is licensed. So in this case, 11 Labs has licensed this content from these people's estates. And so this actually gives their estates and essentially their family members some additional revenue and the ability to capitalize on their likeness. In this case, it's really their voice. But there's some downsides to this. Here you can see that someone had used 11 Labs technology to go ahead and create a fake robocall, essentially a deepfake, from President Joe Biden, President of the United States, one of the most powerful people in the world, urging people not to vote in the New Hampshire presidential primary. So this is where this becomes pretty dangerous in my perspective. But I thought it was quite interesting that we actually now are endorsing this in some cases to be able to go ahead and hear their voice. And there's a part of me, if this is done in a responsible manner, it doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me that Burt Reynolds' family has signed up for this, and people that might be fans of Burt Reynolds be able to hear his voice even though he's passed away. So there's a balance here. Obviously, the key thing is these people have passed away, so there's not this fraud or this ringing endorsement of hey, there's Burt Reynolds promoting the latest version of someone's shoes, which, clearly wouldn't be the case. So I think that's where there's a little bit of balance that I think is being adopted here. Now, this is also related, and I don't know how I feel about this, to be quite honest. So we've got NBC, we've got the Olympics coming up in Paris here in the next few weeks in July, and NBC is actually promoting the use of AI-generated content. And in this case, it's sportscaster Al Michaels. Al Michaels is a legend. He's still alive. He does work for NBC. He's typically part of these very big sporting events. He's been involved in the Olympics before. He's been involved in the NFL and Major League Baseball and kind of you name it. And so he is very prominent. Initially, Al Michaels, and this is an interview, and you can see this on NBC News, is that Al Michaels was skeptical that they could do a good enough job that he would be sort of proud of the work that they're about to do. And he said, and I'm quoting here, it was not only close, he said it was almost 2% off of perfect. This sort of is another sort of interesting situation where NBC is naturally being very transparent about this, which I think is, once again, the most responsible thing to do. If you were trying to deceive people, I feel like that's a different angle here. But what we can expect here is probably more content being generated or created using the likeness of Al Michaels versus what he would normally be able to do as a human being. And I feel this is a little bit of a slippery slope here. Like, at what point do these people not actually, be involved? It's one thing that's different where, Al Michaels being interviewed live. Obviously, there's some perspectives that his employer might want him to convey. But at the end of the day, it's words coming out of his mouth. I'd be willing to bet in this case, he's not reviewing all of the text that's being generated. And then basically being represented through this content. And that's where I feel like there's this like loose association, and where's that sort of accountability if some misinformation, whether on purpose or inadvertent, is actually shared. This is definitely a slippery slope. I'm very curious to see this from a sort of experimentation perspective. Will this content be as good as being sort of promoted here? Will people enjoy this content? And ultimately, I think they're going to decide whether or not this is a good product. If people are like, this is terrible, like I'm turning this off, then, or, I'm like not liking the content or not engaging with the content, then I think NBC will now have sort of a signal that they can use to say, hey, should we do more of this or less? But I also find this kind of interesting that you've got CNBC, which is the business channel, and those hosts on Squawk on the Street, Jim Cramer, David Faber, Carl Quintanilla, are always joking about how they will be replaced and that there will just be avatars that are sort of on screen. And it's kind of interesting that what they joke about happening way down the road is actually being piloted in a few weeks. And so that is a little wild. Once again, I don't know how I feel about this. I think absolutely you got to be transparent. And, I guess we'll see how it goes. And people should ultimately decide if this is a good thing or a bad thing. But definitely something that I'll be looking for. So that concludes this video. Hopefully I've given you some things to think about. That's the whole goal of this series. Once again, I'm learning. I'm not going to profess or claim that I'm an expert in all of this stuff. But it is one of those things where as I find interesting things that I'm learning about, I feel it's worth sharing. If you enjoyed this content, like, subscribes, comments, always welcome. Thanks again.